Welcome to the Writing 1 presentation, Narrative, Starting to Write. This presentation will help you learn how to start writing your own narrative for the first major project in this class. Please follow along with this presentation by turning to Chapter 1 in your How to Write Anything book. The first step in writing your own narrative, especially for our major project, is to come up with some ideas. Now, we do have an entire presentation and a chapter in our book, Chapter 19, and we'll have a presentation in Chapter 2 for a more developed lesson on this topic. But here's some ideas for getting started with this particular project. The book lists some strategies on page 10, and again, these are in more detail in the other lesson and chapter in the book, about brainstorming, building lists. Some people like to just start drawing even and work through that. For this particular project, you might also go through some old photographs. I like that they use the word photographs because maybe for some of us, all those pictures are on digital files now. You can scroll through your old Facebook account, or if you're from way back in the day, look through MySpace, and if you had one of those years ago. But we can look through and find some old pictures, maybe those some good ideas, as they do list social media sites. You can look at other things like that to get ideas. Or maybe you just want to sit in a quiet place for a few minutes and think back. Maybe listen to some songs that were popular a number of years ago and think about what memories those songs bring up. That's something where some of us we relate very well to songs. Another thing is to think about maybe some smells that you relate to a specific story. The smell of something cooking at a place that you like to go, maybe at your house or your grandparents' house. Maybe think about other things of the senses and focus on that, not just sight. So another thing that you can do to come up with ideas is to talk with people. A lot of times parents or other friends, when we say, hey, I have to write this narrative, and you don't have to go into all the details. Make sure you look at the description sheet that I pass out, and that's posted on our course website, of course. But you can sometimes say, hey, I have to write about blah, blah, blah. And other people a lot of times will be happy to brainstorm and give you ideas too. As you start choosing a topic, a couple of things to consider. You may want to generally avoid overdone, major life-changing event stories. And I know other places, other presentations, I say your narrative has to have a point, and that's important. You should have a point. But a lot of times students tend to go for this real easy, and that's when I realized that you only live once, and you have to live life to the fullest. And we tend to sometimes get a little bit cliched, and we get into these cliches that we say. We can talk about what a cliche is in more detail later if you want to individually. But oftentimes with cliches, they're things that are generally true, but they get overdone. They get said so many times that they lose their meaning, and we can even kind of make fun of them a little bit because we hear them so much. So try to avoid things that are these major life-changing event stories that would be just kind of generic, and focus on something that's a little bit more narrow. And we'll talk about that here as time goes on in general, how to narrow topics for papers. But you'll want to consider these things as you're coming up with your ideas. Early on in the stages, what I like to do, what I recommend students do, is come up with a bunch of ideas. And that way you can cross some of them out and say, okay, yeah, that's my YOLO one that maybe I want to avoid. It's a little too cheap. But come up with a whole list of them, because sometimes it's really easy to get in the cycle where you come up with an idea and you immediately find a reason to shoot it down. So start off maybe with a list of ideas. Nothing is a bad idea. Write them all down and then go back and filter through them. That's my recommendation on how to come up with ideas, but you can also find what works for you. As you start working on possible topics, then you want to consider your audience, and this is going to be something that we come back to over time throughout this class. Is this idea of purpose. What is your purpose? And we've talked about that a little bit, having a point, and then who is your target audience? And when we talk about a target audience, it's a core group of people who will relate to your story and appreciate the insight. Maybe you are your own target audience. Sometimes we write things down so that we'll come back and remember them later. We'll remind ourselves of certain things. That's okay. You can use that here. But for this particular project, try to make it so your story does have a broader appeal. So think about other people. Maybe it's your classmates. Maybe it's your family. That can be a tough audience sometimes. Maybe it's your professor. I mean, ultimately, I'm the one who has to grade it. But I shouldn't be the only person in your audience. So try to come up with that. Think about who your audience members are. You also want to then consider your audience. You want to write about people, because people like reading about people. And there's a rhetorical appeal that we can talk about called mythos. That means that people like reading stories about other people. And that definitely applies here. So think about interesting people. Maybe that'll help you come up with some ideas. And when you come up with a topic, that'll help you come up with ideas on how to write about it, is by thinking about the interesting people who are involved. Another thing to consider with your audience is to stick with the essentials. Stay interesting. And along with that, keep it moving. That has to do with pacing. And we're in pages 11 and 12. You can kind of read what the book has to say about this. I think that in sticking with the essentials and staying interesting, that's something that some of us really struggle with. We start telling stories and then we start wandering off the path because we think, well, in order to really understand, you need to understand this other story that happened. I come from a long line of people. I got it from my father, who probably got it from his father, where we tend to tell stories that turn into other stories branching off of those stories. And by the time we kind of finally come back to finishing the original story and our point, nobody's listening. Nobody cares. So we want to stick with the essentials, stay interesting, and then keep it moving. As you can see on page 12, they talk about pace the story, and they give some good advice on how to kind of be in control of how fast or slow the story is going. And that's something that a good skilled writer will learn how to do, is pace things. It takes a lot of practice, and we'll start practicing here with this assignment. So they recommend after a brisk start, so start it kind of quickly, maybe some action, slow the narrative to fill in necessary details, and set up expectations for what will follow. And then that's maybe where you introduce some of your characters. You can mention other things, but again, you want to keep the story moving. And then you need to remember your target audience's needs. Different audiences do have different needs. Some audiences want lots of excitement. They don't really want a lot of detail, so you might scale back on that a little bit. Other audiences, they need to have things explained to them a little bit more. And so if you are telling a story to, say, children, a lot of people assume that children are stupid because they're young and their brains aren't fully developed. But children perceive things, they pick up on a lot of things. But you still do oftentimes have to explain to them and make sure that they understand your point. So remember those needs, and consider your audience as you're constructing your story. As you start building your narrative and constructing the project for this class, you're going to need to consult some research. Now, we're going to have a lot of time in this class where we talk about research for academic papers. We'll get into all those strategies. But right now, think about research in a slightly different way for this particular project. And page 13 on our book gets into some of this. Just some basic highlights off of that. First of all, your own materials and images. And we've talked about that in coming up with ideas. Maybe you'll come up with an idea and realize, oh, maybe I have pictures from that time that will help me with some of my descriptions. Or maybe, spark some other ideas. You can ask other people involved with the story. Now, you need to be warned. This is something where, again, I have taken a lot of classes in what's called creative nonfiction. Again, that's writing true stories, but in a very literary, artistic kind of way. And I've specialized in that in my education. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is that your experiences in memory, that's really what you're writing off of. But when you consult other people, keep in mind that they're going to remember things differently. Maybe something that happened in your family, your sibling is going to remember it a little differently than you do, especially if you disagreed about something at the time. You need to think about this issue of fact versus truth. And there's no completely straight answer on this. You're going to get lots of different opinions from no matter who you ask. I've been at conferences where 100 people will give you maybe 80 different opinions on this. So you need to kind of think about this for yourself. But in telling a story, you do want to use as many facts as possible, but you also want to focus on the truth. And sometimes we don't remember all of the facts, but there is a truth, or at least it is the truth for us in the stories. And a lot of people say to focus more on that truth than on remembering specific facts. You can kind of fill in facts, or you can give in something that might be kind of true. Maybe you weren't wearing a specific outfit that day, but you think about an outfit that you wore when you were 5, when this happened. You see it in a picture, and you don't remember if you were wearing that outfit that day or not, but you can fill in those facts, and they don't really affect the truth of the matter. So again, as you consult research, think about some creative ways you can do that. When you start building your structure for your narrative project here, you want to think about some of the different options that you have. Now again, some of us just naturally tell stories going around in circles and down rabbit trails. We want to avoid that, so it helps to plot out your order of events or your structure as you get started rather than making it up as you go along. So here are some different options. The first couple of images are straight out of our book. The second one, or the third one over on the side, we'll talk about in a minute. You could just do a very simple sequence. This is pretty straightforward, just first event, next event, final event, just kind of going through there. You can also build toward a climax, and this is a pretty common one used. The climax is the most exciting part in the story. It's maybe where everything turns, where, you know, the hero finally confronts the villain and they settle it once and for all. And you can see here they also use the word epiphany. The word epiphany is really interesting because it's something that isn't action that happens on the outside, it's action that happens kind of on the inside. It's a realization, or it's a new truth that the narrator or a character comes to at some point. So maybe you're struggling with some situation, maybe you're writing about a struggle that you had learning something at school, and you work and work and work, and finally you realize something, or you came to some kind of a truth about it, or you came to a truth that made you able to handle the certain situation in your life. So that's an epiphany. So again, you can build toward that. The image on the right looks somewhat like the image on the bottom of page 11 if you want to look at that. I kind of like this a little better. This is a free image that's available on the Wikimedia Commons here too, but it's pretty much you can find this anywhere that we talk about plots and stories. This is sort of a classic narrative arc, and here you have exposition, which is a nice literary word that says basically we're sharing more about the story and what leads up to the action. That's where you describe characters, things like that. Then you have rising action, where again it builds toward that climax or that epiphany. And then there's what's called the falling action. You don't need to know this term, but it's where maybe any action that happens afterwards that gets toward your final resolution is the word that gets used in the book, where everything is kind of tied back up together. The fancy literary word here is denouement. Not going to quiz you on that, but I like that that's in there because it adds a little bit more vocabulary into your words. So choose a structure and create a structure for your story as you start building it, even often before you start writing it, so that you know where things are going to fall and you don't forget certain events and certain pieces that you want to put in there. So what's next for you after this presentation? Well, you'll need to look at the techniques for better writing presentation. That is specifically keyed on your narrative project and how to make that much better piece of writing than what it could be. You'll also want to make sure that you've gotten your readings done, you've looked at any other unit presentations, and of course the usual quiz, discussion forum. Make sure you get those done, and of course your major project, you need to get started on that if you have not already. All right, thanks for watching, everybody.